They say you should never play chicken with a man who understands the laws of buoyancy better than he understands his own children. By the time Sterling realized that $30 million of scrap metal and 100 tons of pressurized seawater don't care about a corporate bonus structure, he was already halfway to a prison sentence and a total personal bankruptcy. The industry of deep-sea salvage is a world of rust, salt, and the kind of pressure that turns a human being into a pancake if they make a mistake. I have spent 24 years as a chief salvage master, specifically focusing on heavy maritime lifts. My job is to take things that have spent 50 years at the bottom of the ocean and bring them back to the surface without snapping cables or causing an environmental disaster. It is a niche, dangerous, and incredibly expensive profession. I spent most of my life on the deck of a recovery barge, smelling of diesel and hydraulic fluid, calculating the exact moment a hull will break suction from the silt on the seafloor. Then came Sterling. Sterling was the kind of man who wore a three-piece suit to a shipyard and looked at a crane like it was a toy he could control with a spreadsheet. He had married the owner's youngest daughter and within 6 months had been fast-tracked to operations manager. He didn't have a single hour of sea time. He had never seen a lift bag explode under pressure, and he had never heard the sound of a steel cable singing just before it snaps and cuts a man in half. Our conflict started at the port of Dampier during the recovery of the Orion Star. The Star was a sunken bulk carrier sitting in 80 meters of water. It was a high-stakes job because the local government was breathing down our necks about a potential fuel leak. My team and I had spent 3 months prepping the site, running ultrasonic tests on the hull, and calculating the ballast requirements. Because the hull was compromised, we couldn't just pump it full of air. We had to use massive industrial lift bags strategically placed to keep the center of gravity stable. Sterling walked onto my barge on a Tuesday morning holding a tablet and looking at our cost projections like they were a personal insult. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask about the safety of the divers. He just pointed at the line item for the specialized heavy-duty lift bags I had ordered from a German manufacturer. These bags were rated for extreme depth and had reinforced valves to prevent a runaway ascent. He told me that he had found a supplier in Southeast Asia that could provide bags for 40% of the cost. I tried to explain to him that those bags were designed for shallow water mowing, not for a 5,000-ton heavy lift in a high-current zone. Sterling just smirked. He told me that my technical caution was actually just a way to pad the budget so I could keep my team on the clock longer. He accused me of being a dinosaur who didn't understand modern procurement strategies. In this industry, there is a specific kind of arrogance you find in people who have never been in a storm. Sterling was the peak of it. He began micromanaging the dive schedules, cutting the unnecessary safety intervals between shifts. He claimed that because the divers were using automated decompression chambers, we could shave 4 hours off every rotation. I told him that he was risking cases of the bends that would ground the entire operation. He responded by threatening to replace me with a more collaborative lead engineer if I didn't get the Orion Star off the bottom by the end of the month. The problem with Sterling wasn't just that he was cheap. It was that he was obsessed with the quarterly performance bonus his father-in-law had promised him if the project finished under budget. He viewed the ocean as a variable in an equation that he could simply ignore if the math didn't suit him. He began ordering the crew to ignore the tension sensors on the primary winches, claiming the alarms were too sensitive and were slowing down the lift speed. I watched him stand on the bridge of the barge, shouting into a radio at men who were 60 men underwater, telling them to stop double-checking the shackle pins. He wanted speed. He wanted numbers. He wanted to prove that he was a genius who had revolutionized maritime salvage by cutting out the waste of safety and expertise. He didn't realize that in deep-sea work, safety protocols are written in the blood of the people who didn't follow them. The tension reached a breaking point when the shipment of his cheap lift bags arrived. They looked like oversized balloons made of thin PVC compared to the heavy-duty Kevlar-reinforced bags I had requested. My head diver Marcus took one look at them and told me he wouldn't trust them to lift a sunken jet ski, let alone a bulk carrier. When I took this concern to Sterling, he told me that Marcus was toxic and that if I didn't start the installation by the morning, he would fire us both for insubordination. He stood there, adjusted his expensive watch, and told me that physics was a flexible concept when he had enough motivation. That was the moment I realized I couldn't save the project from him. I could only save myself. I started thinking about the technical dissent forms that were buried in the back of the company handbook, documents that had been ignored for decades because the previous management actually listened to their engineers. I realized that if I played this exactly right, Sterling wouldn't just lose his bonus. He would be the one standing on the hook when the ocean decided to reclaim its prize. The first real incident happened 3 days after the cheap lift bags arrived. I had spent the morning trying to run a secondary stress test on the anchor points of the Orion star. In salvage, you never trust a single point of failure. I had Marcus and the dive team installing backup steel bridles just in case the hull began to twist under the initial strain. It was slow, grueling work. Sterling came over the radio, his voice crackling with an edge of frantic impatience that usually signals a man who is worried about a spreadsheet. He told me to pull the divers out immediately and stop the frivolous reinforcement. I tried to explain that the silt suction on the bottom was higher than the sonar had initially indicated. If we tried to pull that ship up without the bridles, the hole would essentially act like a giant suction cup, and the sudden release would cause a snapback that could capsize our recovery barge. Sterling didn't want to hear about silt suction. He told me that every hour a diver spent underwater was costing the company $4,000 in hazard pay and insurance. He ordered me to stop the over-engineering and start the inflation of the bags immediately. When I refused, he didn't just yell. He walked down to the deck, grabbed the master dive log, and physically crossed out my instructions for the day. He then turned to my crew and told them that if they followed my unauthorized safety orders, their hours for the week would be voided. He was making it impossible for me to protect the men. I had to spend the next 2 hours in a heated argument in the cramped galley trying to find a middle ground. In the end, I managed to get 2 bridles in instead of the 6 required, but Sterling's victory was evident in the way he smirked at me during dinner. He was systematically dismantling my authority to save a few pennies. The second incident was even dangerous. We were using a specific gas mixture for the deep sea divers, a custom blend of helium and oxygen to prevent nitrogen narcosis at 60 minutes. Because Sterling wanted to cut the logistical overhead, he decided to switch suppliers to a local company that didn't have a maritime certification. I found the tanks on the pier and noticed the seals were inconsistent. When I brought a sample to the on-site lab, the oxygen purity was fluctuating by nearly 3%. In deep diving, a 3% fluctuation is the difference between a clear head and a diver blacking out or seizing underwater. I went to Sterling's office, a converted shipping container with air conditioning that he never left. I told him the gas was tainted and we couldn't dive with it. He didn't even look up from his laptop. He told me that the purity was within acceptable industry margins, according to a pamphlet the supplier had given him. I explained that industry margins for a welder in a shop are not the same as margins for a man working under 6 atmospheres of pressure. He laughed. He actually laughed in my face. He told me that I was just trying to sabotage his new supply chain because I was loyal to the old expensive vendors. To prove his point, he waited until I was supervising a winch calibration on the far side of the barge. And then he personally authorized the dive supervisor, a young guy he'd promoted who was too scared to say no, to start a rotation using the uncertified gas. I only found out when Marcus came up the ladder, vomiting and shivering, complaining of a metallic taste and extreme vertigo. We had to put him in the decompression chamber for 6 hours. Sterling's response was to claim Marcus was faking it to support my narrative of fear. He even threatened to dock Marcus's pay for the time spent in the chamber. I was forced to spend my own money to rush a private shipment of certified gas from a nearby naval base just to keep my men from dying, while Sterling filed a report with the head office claiming I was mismanaging company funds for redundant supplies. The final straw came during the pre-lift inspection. This is the most critical phase where we verify that all lift bags are synchronized. Sterling had hired a third-party efficiency auditor to watch us. To impress this auditor, Sterling decided to speed up the inflation rate of the primary bags by 400%. I told him that the bags, especially his cheap ones, couldn't handle the heat of the rapid friction from the compressed air. They would soften and fail. Sterling turned to the auditor and said, "See, this is what I've been dealing with. Pure obstructionism." Arthur here thinks the laws of thermodynamics don't apply to him. He then grabbed the manifold controls himself. I stood in front of the valves, physically blocking him. I told him that if he touched those controls, I would shut down the entire barge power supply. The auditor looked uncomfortable, but Sterling was vibrating with rage. He didn't touch the valves then, but that night while the Night shift was on duty. He went to the control room and overrode the pressure limiters on the LSS, the life support and safety system that governed the lift bag inflation. He didn't just mess with the project, he tampered with the core safety software. When I walked in the next morning and saw the logs, I realized the bags were already strained to their absolute limit, sitting at a pressure that made them literal ticking time bombs on the ocean floor. I realized then that talking to Sterling was like talking to a landslide. You don't reason with it, you just get out of the way and let it hit the bottom. I stopped trying to fix the problems. I stopped arguing. I went to my cabin, opened the company's internal legal portal, and began the process of filing a notice of technical dissent and transfer of total liability. It was a document that, once signed by a senior manager, removed all professional responsibility from the engineer and placed it squarely on the person, ordering the override. I knew Sterling would sign it because his ego wouldn't let him believe he could ever be wrong. He thought he was signing a document that proved I was a coward. In reality, he was signing his own financial death warrant. The turning point arrived with a phone call from Silas, the owner of the company and Sterling's father-in-law. For 20 years, Silas and I had shared a mutual respect built on dozens of successful recoveries. But when I answered the phone, his voice was cold. Sterling had spent the last 48 hours building a meticulously forged narrative. He hadn't just complained about my slow pace. He had sent Silas a doctored file suggesting I was taking kickbacks from the German bag manufacturer. He had created fake email chains and manipulated invoice requests to make it look like I was intentionally delaying the Orion Star project to drain the company's emergency reserves into my own pocket. Silas told me that based on the evidence provided by Sterling, my seniority was being stripped. My pension was being frozen, pending a forensic audit, and I was being removed as chief salvage master. Sterling wasn't just firing me, he was annihilating my legacy. He was ensuring that even if I walked away, I would never work in maritime salvage again. I would be blacklisted from every port from Singapore to Rotterdam. The reputation I had spent 2 decades building in the salt and the mud was being dissolved by a man who didn't know the difference between a winch and a capstan. I sat in my cabin on the barge for a long time, listening to the hum of the generators and the slap of the waves against the hull. The sadness I expected to feel never came. Instead, a deep crystalline coldness settled over my bones. I realized that the rules I had lived by, honesty, safety, and professional integrity, were being used as weapons against me. If I tried to defend myself to Silas now, it would just look like the desperate lies of a caught thief. Sterling had won the game of corporate politics, but he had forgotten that we weren't in an office. We were on a barge, suspended over a catastrophic failure of his own making. I stood up, packed my personal dive computer, and walked towards Sterling's office. I didn't look at the crew. I didn't look at Marcus. I was done being the protector. If Sterling wanted to be the genius in charge, I was going to give him exactly what he asked for: total unmitigated control. Sterling was leaning back in his chair, boots up on the desk, looking at the efficiency award he had already drafted for himself on his laptop. He looked at me with a smirk that told me he knew exactly what Silas had said. He expected me to beg or to shout or to plead for my pension. I did none of those things. I placed a single 3-page document on his desk. It was the notice of technical dissent and transfer of total liability. I had drafted it with a level of precision that only a man who has read every line of maritime insurance log. Sterling was leaning back in his chair, boots up on the desk, looking at the efficiency award he had already drafted for himself on his laptop. He looked at me with a smirk that told me he knew exactly what Silas had said. He expected me to beg or to shout or to plead for my pension. I did none of those things. I placed a single 3-page document on his desk. It was the notice of technical dissent and transfer of total liability. I had drafted it with a level of precision that only a man who has read every line of maritime insurance law could achieve. I told him in a flat, emotionless voice that since he was now the acting technical lead and I was being removed, the insurance underwriters required a formal handover of the life support and safety LSS protocols. I explained that the document simply stated that he was taking full responsibility for the optimized lift procedures and the use of the alternative lift bags as he had overridden my initial engineering plan. I told him that if he signed it, I would leave the barge immediately and quietly without making a scene in front of the crew or the board. Sterling's eyes lit up. To him, this wasn't a legal trap. It was a surrender document. It was the ultimate trophy. By signing this, he believed he was officially proving that my expertise was unnecessary and that he was the sole architect of the project's success. He didn't even read the fine print in Section 4.2, the clause that specified that the signatory assumed personal financial liability for environmental cleanup costs in the event of a grossly negligent override of established safety sensors. He didn't notice the part where he acknowledged that he intentionally bypassed the pressure alarms I had set. He grabbed a pen and signed it with a flourish, his signature large and arrogant. He then slid the paper back to me and told me I had 1 hour to get off his barge. He told me that dinosaurs like me were the reason the industry was dying and that he was going to be the man who finally made salvage profitable. I took the signed original, scanned it into the company's cloud server using my still active administrative credentials, and sent a blind copy to the insurance company's legal department and the Maritime Safety Board. I didn't add a comment. I didn't need to. The data in the LSS logs, which Sterling had tampered with, would now be linked directly to his signature. As I walked toward the transport boat, Marcus stopped me. He looked terrified. He asked me what they were supposed to do now that the bags were at critical pressure and the hull suction was at its peak. He knew the math didn't add up. I looked Marcus in the eye. For months, I had been the one staying up until 3 a.m. to balance the loads and keep those men safe. I felt a momentary pang of guilt, but I knew that if I stayed, I would be the one blamed for the inevitable. I told Marcus to tell the crew that if the primary winch tension hit 120%, they were to abandon the deck and move to the aft starboard lifeboats immediately. I told him not to wait for Sterling's permission. Marcus nodded, seeing something in my face that he had never seen before. A total lack of empathy for the vessel. I stepped onto the transport boat. As we pulled away from the barge, I looked back at the Orion Star. Under the dark, churning water, the cheap PVC bags were screaming under the strain of Sterling's rapid inflation command. The ship was still stuck in the mud, held down by thousands of tons of suction, while the air inside the bags was expanding with nowhere to go. Sterling was standing on the bridge, his hands on his hips, looking out over the ocean as if he had already conquered it. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt like a spectator. The Blue Death, the slang we use for the high-pressure hydraulic failure that happens right before a structural snap, was already beginning. The sensors were screaming, but Sterling had muted the alarms. I turned my back on the barge and told the pilot to head for the mainland. The trap was set. The liability was signed. And all I had to do was wait for the ocean to do what I had spent 20 years preventing it from doing. Sterling wanted the optimized version of salvage. He was about to find out that the ocean doesn't do discounts. The revenge wasn't a single event. It was a masterpiece of malicious compliance and the cold, hard application of fluid dynamics. Sterling thought he had won because he held the pen, but he had forgotten that I held the keys to the life support and safety software. When I filed that notice of technical dissent, I didn't just transfer the blame. I activated a very specific set of automated protocols that Sterling, in his haste to be the hero, had never bothered to investigate. In maritime salvage, there is a specialized system called the Delta P Governor. It is a fail-safe designed to prevent a runaway ascent. If a ship suddenly breaks free from the silt suction, it can shoot to the surface like a cork, expanding the air in the lift bags so rapidly that they explode, causing the wreck to plummet back down and crush anything beneath it, including our recovery barge. To prevent this, I had programmed the governor to a hair trigger sensitivity. However, Sterling had complained that these micro-adjustments were slowing down the lift. He had ordered me to disable the annoying automatic venting valves. I complied, but I didn't just turn them off. I set them to manual override mode, which meant they would only vent if a physical command was entered from the primary engineering station. Then I locked that station with an encrypted diagnostic loop. According to the company's own efficiency protocol, which Sterling himself had drafted and implemented a month prior, all encrypted loops could only be bypassed by the designated operations manager using their personal biometric key. He had insisted on this rule to prevent low-level employees from tampering with his optimized settings. He had literally locked the only safety valve in the ocean behind his own thumbprint. Next, I turn my attention to the insurance requirements. Every major lift requires a stability observer to be present on a separate vessel to verify the center of gravity. Usually this is a formality, but I knew that the Orion Star was resting on a slight incline. If the bow lifted even 3 degrees faster than the stern, the cheap Southeast Asian bag Sterling bought would slide toward the higher point due to their lack of internal friction ribbing. This is known as the pendulum effect. I sent a very polite, very formal email to the insurance underwriter CCing Sterling's father-in-law, Silas. I didn't complain. I didn't mention the firing. I simply attached the optimized lift schedule Sterling had authorized and noted that per the new management's direction, the stability observer was being replaced by an automated drone feed to reduce costs. I knew the underwriter would see this and immediately trigger a high-risk premium search charge. Under Sterling's signed liability waiver, any surcharges or fines resulting from management overrides were to be deducted directly from the project's performance bonus pool. Sterling was effectively paying for his own downfall without realizing it. The final domino was the Blue Death itself. In hydraulic salvage, we use a specific dyed fluid to detect leaks in the high-pressure lines. I knew the cheap bag Sterling ordered used non-standard 12mm couplings. Our barge hoses were 12.5mm. It's a tiny difference. But under 50 tons of pressure, that half gap creates a high-velocity spray that can cut through a steel deck. I had noticed Sterling's procurement team had tried to bridge the gap using industrial adhesive and standard hardware store clamps. I didn't fix it. I didn't even mention it. Instead, I performed a system integrity check and logged the result as compliant with managerial procurement standards. This was the technical equivalent of saying it's broken, but since you bought it, I'll call it fixed. By logging it this way, I ensured that when the couplings inevitably failed, it couldn't be blamed on installation error or maintenance neglect. It would be classified as a material failure of management-authorized equipment. I spent my last hour on the barge quietly adjusting the drone's broadcast frequency. I set it to a public maritime frequency used by the local port authority and the regional news stations. I labeled the stream Orion, Star Recovery, a new era of efficiency. I wanted the world to see Sterling's triumph. I wanted the investors, the regulators, and the environmental agencies to have a front-row seat to the optimization. As the transport boat hit the mainland, I checked my phone. The lift was scheduled for 2 p.m. to catch the high tide. Sterling, ever the showman, had invited a local news crew onto the pier to watch the miracle of his cost-saving techniques. He was standing there in a pristine white hard hat, giving an interview about how he had trimmed the fat from a bloated engineering department. I sat in a small bar across the harbor, ordered a cold beer, and opened my laptop. I pulled up the public stream. The sensors showed the primary winches were at 110% capacity. The silt suction was holding the ship like a magnet. Sterling was on the radio, his voice booming over the speakers on the pier, ordering the divers to max out the air. He was forcing more and more pressure into those cheap PVC bags. I could see the Blue Death on the drone feed. A thin, misty spray of bright blue hydraulic fluid was already leaking from the primary manifold. The one Sterling had locked with his own biometric key. The pressure was building. The Orion Star wasn't moving, but the bags were expanding, turning into giant, distorted sausages beneath the ship's hull. I watched the tension meter on my screen. 115%, 118%, 120%. On the screen, I saw Marcus and the crew suddenly drop their tools and sprint for the lifeboats, just as I had told them to do. Sterling was screaming at them through a megaphone, calling them cowards, telling them they were fired. He didn't understand why they were running. He didn't see the tiny blue mist turning into a roaring jet of hydraulic oil. He didn't feel the vibration in the deck that precedes a catastrophic structural collapse. He was too busy looking at his watch, waiting for his bonus to materialize. I took a sip of my beer and watched the digital gauge hit 125%. The ocean was about to present its bill, and Sterling had already signed the check. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was a rhythmic metallic shriek that echoed across the harbor, the sound of 5,000 tons of steel suddenly losing its grip on the earth. On the drone feed, the Orion Star didn't rise. It buckled. Because Sterling had bypassed the Delta P governor, the silt suction didn't release gradually.